Hey guys, Political Junkie 2414 here, and welcome back to another video. Today, I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. I'm not going to be giving, my typical prediction video as to, the state of the Senate or the state of the House or whatever. I'm going to be closing in on two specific races in terms of the Senate majority. These are not particularly important or as important as some of the other states. They're not getting talked about as much. These are two light, open states or open seats in light blue states in Minnesota and New Hampshire. The Democrats are defending. I'm mostly going to be talking about the primaries here. And because I think that these are very interesting in terms of indication, and they provide good indications of where the party is going. The National Republican Senatorial Committee has recruited candidates for both of these races, and while they are kind of on the periphery of being competitive, I want to talk about something different today, and I think that this is, the primaries are interesting here on the Democratic side, and to a lesser extent on the Republican side, but we're mostly going to be talking about the Democratic side today. And I also just think these are going to be, indications of where the party's going, and while Dems are, favored to hold both, we're going to talk about it. But before we get into that, I just wanted to say I have started, I've been working on this Substack. I have a Substack page, Congress, the White House, and all the rest. This election cycle, I have been posting my predictions for each of the primary seasons. I've been meaning to upload or, post recommendations to you guys, but because I haven't uploaded, regularly in quite some time, the algorithm hates me on YouTube, so I don't think that you guys have been getting as much content from me or as many notifications. I haven't been showing up in people's streams, so that's part of the reason why I'm making videos like this. I also just want to get back to making videos, but anyways, latest video or article I wrote was on the Arizona primaries this past week. If you can go back, you can see some of my predictions about the New York primaries, Georgia, Colorado's governor race, etc., etc. So anyways, if you could go, if you're on Substack and you could give that, some love, I would really appreciate it. And so there's going to be a lot of overlap between those two, between this channel and the my Substack page. But anyways, let's get into talking about some of these races. So we'll start with Minnesota, because this is the one that I think is, generally speaking, the one that has the more, recognizably competitive Democratic primary, and it's also the one that's just getting talked about a little bit more. Minnesota is a light blue state. It's pretty stubbornly blue. It has not voted for a Republican presidential candidate since Richard Nixon in 1972. It hasn't voted for a Republican senator since 2002. And Democrats, but Republicans here, when Tina Smith, who won re-election in 2020 by 5 points, she decided to retire, and at the beginning of the election cycle, about a year and a half ago, when Democrats were still kind of picking up the pieces from 2024, I mean, to be fair, they still are, this was the seat that John Thune, the Senate Majority Leader, the Republican Majority Leader, was targeting. This is one where they recruited a candidate in Michelle Tafoya, who I think was a sports broadcaster, This was a seat that, was likely to still stay with the Democrats, but it was a seat that, in a good-ish midterm year for Republicans, could have been competitive. It could have been a seat that they could have picked off. Now, I think that there are several reasons why this state is getting out of reach for the Republicans, which we'll talk about it a little bit, but let's talk about the Democratic primary, because that is something that I think on the surface would make, this race a little bit more competitive for the Republicans than, you would expect. So because of Smith's retirement, we basically have a two-way primary here, and this is, I would say that this is a very similar dynamic to the Michigan Senate primary that is playing out right now, which has really taken up all the oxygen in terms of Senate primaries and generational fights in the Democratic primary, or Democratic Party in 2026. This primary is a week after the Michigan primary, so I think that we'll be hearing more about this soon once Michigan wraps up. But right now, it is a two-way race between Congresswoman Angie Craig, who represents a suburban district outside of Minneapolis, and who currently is like the top Democrat on the House Agriculture Committee. And then you have Peggy Flanagan, who is the Lieutenant Governor of Minnesota. She's been Tim Walz's number two. And so this is a proxy war for the Democrats. Between this is very much an ideological fight here in Minnesota. Angie Craig, if you look down at the endorsements, she has a lot of the Democratic establishment behind her. She has Pete Buttigieg. She has several Democratic senators from swing states. She has Nancy Pelosi's endorsement and the endorsement of many in House leadership. She has Jacob Fry's endorsement, the mayor of Minneapolis. And, as one of the major flashpoints in Democratic primaries, she is a candidate backed by the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. And if you've been following, Democratic politics for the last couple of years, you know that that support for Israel has become incredibly toxic in Democratic primaries. On the other hand, you have Peggy Flanagan, and you have just as many, about just as many Democratic senators supporting Craig that are supporting her. She is the favorite of Bernie Sanders. She has Al Franken's endorsement, who previously held the seat before Tina Smith retired. So she is very much the progressive choice here. And she, I think that there are several reasons here why Flanagan is favored to win this primary. I think number one, she is if you've been following the last couple Senate primaries, you would know the Democrats are definitely picking these sort of anti-establishment candidates, and this is true for House as well. But the establishment has had some success recently. In light of the Minneapolis raids this past January, Craig is not in favor of abolishing ICE, and given the killings of Renee Good and Alex Preddy and the anger that Democrats across the country, have against ICE, especially in Minnesota, Flanagan being the only candidate who has, committed to abolishing ICE, that is a huge, huge factor in this race. I think that, in more than any other state, Minnesota is a state where that's going to have a major impact. In addition, Flanagan just hits all of the, right points in terms of winning Democratic primary candidates. You look at Graham Plattner in Maine, even though, he's dropped out, he won on an anti-corruption platform. Janet Mills was viewed as part of the DC establishment, Chuck Schumer's handpicked candidate. If you look at, say, a candidate like Juliana Stratton in Illinois, she was the candidate who repeatedly said that she was not taking corporate PAC money, that she would not vote for Chuck Schumer for leader. And that's another thing too. Craig has reportedly received the backing of the of Senate Democrats' campaign arm, although it's not been, it's not an official, and they've not officially endorsed her. So she is technically Chuck Schumer's handpicked candidate, but it's not official, like it is for Haley Stevens in Michigan. But regardless, Flanagan is the anti-establishment candidate here, and I think that really helps her. But Craig definitely has been, I think, gaining momentum in the last couple of weeks. Well, she hasn't. So we haven't had a lot of nonpartisan polling here. I think that is the problem with this race. Recently, we've gotten some polls from Survey USA, but you see, most of these polls are Flanagan internals, and internals can be helpful to an extent in terms of trends. They were helpful in Illinois with Juliana Stratton because the Democratic Lieutenant Governors Association, which has, I think, which has endorsed Flanagan as well, showed Stratton gaining on her primary opponents before she ended up winning on, the Illinois Senate primary in March. So definitely trends can help. And if you look at the trends, you would see that Peggy Flanagan is losing ground. But if you look at, she still leads in the vast majority of polls. And Survey USA, we only have two nonpartisan polls here, really. Angie Craig does seem to have lost a little bit of momentum. She led by 5 points in this June survey, and she led Flanagan 41 to 36%. In the most recent poll, we have a dead heat here. From Survey USA, we have Craig and Flanagan tied, and I think some of that has to do with the fact that this is a state where I think in many of the same ways that say regardless of whether Craig has been gaining or Flanagan has been gaining, a trend that we've been seeing with Democratic primaries in the last couple of years, especially with Juliana Stratton and Angela Alsobrooks in Maryland, is that the candidate who is, say, more progressive does tend to gain, traction in the last couple of weeks. Angela Alsobrooks was really far behind up until the final weeks of the primary to replace Ben Cardin in 2024, and so was Juliana Stratton earlier this year. They both came, ahead and won it. Craig, I think, has, if you ask me my professional opinion, I would say that Craig has gained ground here, overall compared to where she was a year ago. But, and I think a lot of that has to do with her fundraising advantage. She has consistently outraised Flanagan. She has more cash on hand. I think a large part of that, just has to do with the fact that she is a sitting member of Congress. And she also has super PACs on her side. But I would say in the last couple of weeks, if we're talking about nonpartisan polling, it is apparent to me that, we're seeing Flanagan kind of rebound. So overall, I think when you ask me how this primary is going to go, I'm going to pick Flanagan. In terms of who I think is more likely to win the general, either way, I think that, in a year that looks good for Democrats, I don't see Republicans, unless we have like a really bad time, really bad year for Democrats, which I don't think is going to happen. It would have to be worse than 2024, and I find that incredibly unlikely. I think that either of these candidates would win comfortably, especially, given the, alienation of Republicans in Minnesota following the ICE raids, and also just the fact that Republicans are likely to nominate Mike Lindell for the governorship and Amy Klobuchar is the Democratic nominee. I think either of these candidates would win. I do think at the end of the day that Craig would win by a larger amount, and a large part of that has to do with the fact that in her House elections, she did win in 2024. This is a district that voted for Kamala Harris by 5. She won by 14. And I think that speaks to her. I think if she was running for re-election here, she would be winning by a safe margin in 2026. So I do think that ultimately she would be a better candidate electorally for Democrats, but at the end of the day, I find it hard to believe that Republicans are going to put this seat in play. So that's it really, I think, for Minnesota. We're about 12 minutes in. Let's go to New Hampshire. I think New Hampshire, this is a state, this is, a light blue state as well. It is a little bit more swingy. It has voted it has voted for a Republican presidential candidate and for a Republican senator much more recently on the presidential side. Last time it voted red was in 2000 for George W. Bush, and then he lost it to John Kerry in 2004, and it's been blue ever since. It has been a little bit closer, and this is something that I meant to point out with Minnesota too. These two states are ones that Kamala Harris, these were kind of some of the only battleground states where Kamala Harris did better than Hillary Clinton. In 2024, Georgia is an exception, to be fair, and I guess North Carolina technically too. But New Hampshire, this is a light blue state. It last voted for a Republican presidential candidate in 2000, and it last voted for a Republican senator in 2010. So, in a normal year, if we look back at the last election here in 2020 for this seat, Jeanne Shaheen, who is the retiring incumbent here, won by an overwhelming amount. She won every county in the state. Biden won this, New Hampshire by around 8 points. So it was a pretty, decisive margin for him. after Hillary Clinton almost lost the state in 2016. But Shaheen crushed it, and Republicans didn't really contest this race. Now, I do think, this race is different from Minnesota in several ways. I do believe in the general election, it is a sleeper for Republicans. I don't think that it's one that they're seriously, I think they have a much better chance at actually winning New Hampshire than they do in Minnesota. The reason why I want to talk about the Democratic primary here, though, is because Chris Pappas, who represents about one of the state's 2 congressional districts, he represents basically half of the state. I think he has long been the front runner for this primary, and that is not changing. I really do believe that Pappas is the front runner. He is a shoo-in for the nomination in many ways, but I think a lot of people are not talking about this primary and some of the trends that we're seeing with primary polling here. Karishma Mansour, who was a member of the New Hampshire Democratic Party Rules Committee, has, I think, kind of opened up a lane, and he is gaining ground here. He is endorsed by pro-Palestinian groups here. Pappas is endorsed by pretty much the entire, the Democratic establishment in New Hampshire. He's endorsed by by AIPAC, and he has a significant cash-on-hand advantage and polling advantage. However, I am reminded of the Colorado Senate primary here. If you don't know, in just a couple weeks ago, John Hickenlooper, the incumbent Democratic senator, nearly lost his primary to a Democratic Socialist, Julie Gonzalez. This was not a primary that was expected to be competitive up until maybe the last couple of weeks. It was kind of shocking. This was not one that Democrats had really invested in, at all. And she came within 6 points of winning. So I guess what I'm trying to get at here is, well, Colorado. I think New Hampshire's or Colorado's a lot bluer than New Hampshire, and Pappas clearly is holding up better, and Mansour doesn't seem to. I don't really know much about the candidate. I cannot deny the polling trends here. If you look at the University of New Hampshire and St. Anselm College, these are both veteran pollsters in New Hampshire. You look at where they put Pappas in 2020, in November of last year. He basically had a 50-point advantage. You look at that now, it's down to 24 points. And this is a trend, and I want to remind you all, this is not a primary that's coming up in a couple weeks. This is 6 weeks away. This is one New Hampshire holds its primaries, I believe, on September 8th. Let me look. Yeah, September 8th. So we have a ways to go for this primary, and I think that could definitely narrow the margin for Pappas. Now, do I think he's ultimately going to lose this primary? No. But I do think that this is something that Democrats need to watch out for. It's kind of surprising, honestly, because Democrats from New Hampshire that end up in Congress are some of the most centrist the most centrist members of the House and Senate Democratic caucuses. You look at Jeanne Shaheen, you look at Maggie Hassan, and Chris Pappas. They are deal makers. They are very much bipartisan, and they do well. New Hampshire likes their centrists. So the reason why I think that Mansour is tapping into, is getting closer here, number one, Pappas is kind of the establishment choice, and that's a big deal. But I also think it has something to do with New Hampshire's libertarian bend. If you know anything about New Hampshire politics, you would know it's a socially liberal but fiscally conservative state. It's live free or die is their sort of their mantra, and they're not big fans of taxes. And the way that Democratic circles have been portraying the pro-Israel pro-Israel politics is that it's a waste of tax dollars. And so while New Hampshire would be in better Democratic hands, or be a strong, Democrats would be in a much better place of winning it if they run Chris Pappas, which I do think is much more likely than not. Mansour, I think, is going to make this primary more competitive because he's tapping into that libertarian bend, because he's portraying himself as sort of the outsider candidate here. And there's been no polling of him against Republicans' preferred candidate, John Sununu, who looks incredibly likely to win the GOP primary. He's been building up a lead, he's been expanding his lead against former Massachusetts Senator Scott Brown. But Mansoura, I think that this is going to be an interesting primary to watch. I want to see some more polling here. I want to see if this, if New Hampshire gets a little bit closer, because, if you look at even St. Anselm College, you look at a 60-point edge for Pappas, in mid-March. By the end of last month, it was, just down to 42%. So something's happening here, and I think that that's going to be very, very, very interesting. And as I've said, Pappas is very much the, much more electable candidate here. I think that John Sununu, who Republicans have lined up against, I'll go through this quickly. He is the candidate who's preferred by Senate Republicans and by Donald Trump, even though, Sununu endorsed Nikki Haley in the Republican primary for, president in 2024. And just to be clear, John Sununu, this is not the former governor of New Hampshire. This is Chris Sununu's brother. He served as a senator from New Hampshire, until he lost to Shaheen in 2008. Anyways, he is clearly, if you look at polling between him and Pappas, Brown, Pappas does much better or much worse against Sununu than he does against Brown, which makes sense because Brown technically has already lost a Senate race in New Hampshire before he lost one in he was originally representing Massachusetts. He lost one in New Hampshire in 2014, which was, one of the few competitive races the Democrats ended up winning that year, for the Senate anyway. But if you look at Sununu here, University of New Hampshire has him, down by 3. They have Scott down by 14. So that's a big deal. If you look at the polling averages, the overall average of all these aggregates, Pappas is up by 5 against Sununu. He's up against Brown by 12. But I think it's, if you look at the polling here, much more likely that Pappas faces Sununu than he does Brown. So anyways, I guess that kind of takes us till the end of the video. I just really wanted to make a video about some of these Senate races that are not really getting a lot of love. Ultimately, these are not the most important Senate races in the book. I think New Hampshire could definitely be a bit of a sleeper, but, I understand why these races are not really getting talked about. These are not the races that we're going to be talking about probably come November. I want to make one on some of the other races that are more critical to the Senate majority, but I think that these are two that have kind of, been lost, and I think that these are ones to watch out for. I especially wanted to make this video about New Hampshire because I do think that this primary is going to get a little bit more attention, because I expect it to get closer just based on the trends here in the polling, and polling trends are often, some of the most, even when the polls are wrong, polling trends are almost always, pretty reliable. So yeah, thank you all so much for watching this video. If, you liked it, if you enjoyed what you saw, like the video, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, share this video with someone who you think would enjoy it. As always, check out my, Substack, Congress, the White House, and all the rest, and check out some of my other videos on the 2026 elections. I will see you guys soon. I'm going to be making more videos on some of these Senate races and gubernatorial races. I plan to make, my first governor prediction very soon, and, an updated House prediction as well. So yeah, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time when I talk about all things politics. See ya.